Dear colleagues, let's start with our special session within the section World Economy. I'm very glad to introduce our honorary speaker, Wladimir Andreff, who is a professor emeritus of University Paris 1 Panthéon Sorbonne. He is very famous specialist in sports economy, but I knew him for many years as a brilliant specialist in foreign direct investments. He was one of pioneers of the topic of outward FDI from post-socialist and developing countries. And today his honorary paper and honorary paper report will be just about outward foreign direct investments from new wave emerging countries. Firstly, I will give a floor to our guest, and then after his report, we will have a round of questions and answers. Please, Vladimir.
Thank you, Alexei. So first, I would thank the organizers of this International Academic Conference on Economic and Social Development convened by the Higher School of Economics Moscow for having invited me. And in particular, I would thank Alexei Kuznetsov for introducing me and giving me the floor now. So my topic is, as he announced, outward foreign direct investment from new wave emerging countries. So please, next slide. So as a matter of introduction, as you probably know, in the 21st century, I mean, in the past 2 decades, the most dynamic outward foreign direct investment in the following, I will say OFDI. So the most dynamic OFDI is no longer achieved by multinational companies from developed market economies like the US or Western European countries, as it was used to be the case in the 20th century. Instead, the most dynamic foreign investors in the world now are from the so-called BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So if you want to read something about this topic that I have written, I could refer you to the European Journal of Comparative Economics, an issue in 2016. Another group of countries is investing very fast abroad in the past 2 decades or so. There are so-called post-communist transition economies. And here again, if you are interested in, I would refer you to a paper I've published in Вопросы экономики in Russian, or the Russian Journal of Economics in 2017. But that's not all the groups of fast investing abroad. Among those countries investing abroad, the fastest are also a group or an unheeded group of emerging countries that I would coin the new wave emerging countries. New wave emerging countries, or the NWICs in the following, okay? So first point, which countries are gathered in the NWICs group? Please, next slide. So I have attempted to sample this group of NWICs in a very short paper published by an Italian institution for research, Osservatorio sulle Economie Emergenti. So it's an observatory on emerging economies. And I decided to sample a group of major investors, which are not those well-known so far, that is, they are not developed market economies, or they are not the BRICS. So how did I proceed? I defined a major OFDI home country as a country holding at least $1 billion OFDI stock abroad as of December 31st, 2014. And with this criterion at hand, I came to the UNCTAD database on foreign direct investment. And the outcome was I found 91 countries which were major direct investors abroad according to my definition. Okay? But then I had to drop some countries from the sample because it is a sample on emerging countries. So I first dropped developed market economies, that is all the economies with gross national income per capita higher than $20,000. And then I was left with only 61 countries. Then I subtracted from the sample the 5 BRICS, since they are studied in different papers, and I was left with 56 countries left in the sample. Then I deduced from the sample those post-communist economies in transition. There were 16 among the 91. There were 16. So I was left with 40 countries. But in these 40 countries, we can witness 17 countries which are very specific because I would call them rent-depending countries. That is, countries which are investing practically only in oil, gas, mining, natural resources, like Saudi Arabia and so on, okay? So I skipped them out from the sample and I was left with 23 countries. And among these 23 countries, I witnessed that there are 10 tax havens or tax-friendly small economies, okay, in the Caribbean Sea and so on, okay? So I skipped them out from the sample again, and I was left with only 13 countries, and I coined these countries the new wave emerging countries. Next slide, please. So you can see these 13 countries in table 1 about outward foreign direct investment stock, sampling the 13 weeks. And they are ranked in 2014 according to their OFDI stock, their investment abroad. And you see that in 2014, Malaysia was the first one, followed then by Mexico, Chile, Thailand, Colombia, Turkey, Argentina, the Philippines, Indonesia, Nigeria, Egypt, Iran, and Pakistan. Next slide, please. So one question is, why group these 13 countries together except my criterion, okay, of 1 billion OFDI stock? So I proceeded with a few statistical tests, calculating standard deviations, the coefficient of variation, and so on. And it appeared that the NWICs are a rather homogeneous group. It is more homogeneous than the BRICS, for instance, but it is also more homogeneous than developed market economies, than post-communist transition economies, than the rent-dependent countries or the tax havens, okay? They are more homogeneous when it comes to the distribution of their GDP size. They are more homogeneous when it comes to the distribution of their population, regarding the distribution of their geographical size in square kilometers, or in terms of their GDP growth rate. So I concluded, okay, this sample is significant to some extent. The NWICs resemble the BRICS. They are a kind of smaller BRICS. So I calculated the statistical average in the sample, and the statistically average NWIC in 2014 was a country of roughly 108 million inhabitants with a GDP of $516 billion, with a geographical size of, on average, 1,120,000 square kilometers, a gross national income per capita of roughly $7,400 per inhabitant or per capita, and over the period of time from 2006 to 2014, 4.6 GDP rate of growth, which is the fastest growth after the BRICS. Okay, and if one accepts developed market economies, if we put them aside of my analysis, the NWICs are the second biggest, richest, and most developed group of countries after the BRICS in the world economy. And also, this group is the second biggest foreign investor group in terms of FDI stock after the BRICS and, of course, the developed market economies. So, next slide, table 2. Please, next slide. So you can see in this slide that some of the NWICs had a faster growth in outward foreign direct investment stock. During the period of time from 2000 to 2009, the fast-growing investors abroad were Indonesia, then Egypt, then Thailand, and then Mexico, for instance. And from 2009 to 2018, the fastest growing investors abroad were the Philippines, then Thailand, then Colombia, and then Chile. Okay, next slide, please. Next, overall, on average, the OFDI stock from the NWICs was multiplied by 3 over 2000-2009. And the fastest growing countries may compare with the growth of OFDI from China, where the stock, OFDI stock, was multiplied by 8.4 between 2000 and 2009. They compare to Russia, multiplied by 12.4, but they don't compare with India, where the OFDI stock was multiplied by about 40. And during the 2010s, I mean until 2018, OFDI from the NWICs was slightly less affected by global recession and then slower economic growth than OFDI from the BRICS. So from the NWICs, OFDI stock was nearly multiplied by 3 again over the period of time 2009-2008, as against multiplied by 1.5 from Brazil, 1.4 from Russia, 2.2 from India. So the only exception, which still is growing very fast in terms of OFDI, is China, with a stock multiplied by 8.4. So in 2018, the most investing abroad among the NWICs, which was Mexico, held an OFDI stock, the value of which was close to the value of India's OFDI stock abroad. And the second ranked, Malaysia, held an OFDI stock bigger than half the Brazilian OFDI stock. So all this OFDI was backed by a number of multinational companies based in the 13 NWICs. I've been able to identify 359 multinational companies based in my sample. Of course, this group of multinationals is not exhaustive, because I've checked them in the literature in some databases, but of course, there are probably more than these companies to be sampled. So please, next slide. In the next slide, you have a table 3, where the number of multinational companies I've been able to identify in the NWICs. So the biggest number is for Malaysia, 70. Then you have Argentina, 44. You have Mexico, 41, and so on and so forth. You have the brand names on the right side of the slide. So Cemex is from the cement industry in Mexico. Cime Darby and Berjaya are from Malaysia. Probably you know Orascom. Orascom was from Egypt, and it was taken over by Wimpelcom, which is a Russian company, meanwhile, and so on. So you have an idea of the kind of companies you can identify. So next slide, please. I will come back now to a short historical perspective. The multinational companies from my sample, from my country sample, started investing abroad at a different periods of time. So companies from Argentina started to invest abroad as early as in the 1920s. Okay, and now they are not the first one. They are growing less fast than in the other countries. So in the late 1960s, two other countries started to invest abroad, Mexico and Malaysia. So they are the leaders nowadays. Okay. Then during the 1970s, other countries in my sample started to invest abroad: Chile, Colombia, Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand. And we have some laggards. Pakistan and Nigeria started up investing abroad only in the 1980s, and Iran only in the 1990s. So next slide, please. The other aspect of this short historical perspective is this table about investing abroad from the mid-1980s until 1999. And here again, you see that some countries were growing faster in terms of OFDI than others. So the fastest was Thailand from the mid-80s to the end of the century. The second one was Chile, then came Indonesia, then Malaysia, and I would stop here. Next slide, please. So what about literature review and the theoretical background to my paper? The first thing is that there is no matter for typical literature review, because there is not a single publication on the NWIC sample or on their OFDI until today, because nobody knows what are the NWICs. Okay, it's brand new. It's my sample, my own sample. So no real literature review. The other point I would make is that there is a paucity of data and a very scattered literature on OFDI from these 13 countries. And in particular, it's rather scarce in English. But I don't read the Thai language, or I don't read the Turkish and so on. So you are stuck with this, okay? This is for the literature review. Now I collected two theories which seem to me to be relevant to analyze OFDI from the NWICs. So the first one is Dunning's very well-known investment development path model, which links foreign direct investment cycle with 5 successive stages of economic development. So the oldest paper in this area by Dunning dates back to 1981. You can see it on the screen. Okay, very well known, and he published a lot about this topic afterwards. And you know that in this model, the first 3 stages are the following. Stage 1, you have countries which are the least advanced countries. They are invested from abroad. They receive foreign investment, but they don't invest abroad. No OFDI, 0 OFDI, according to Dunning model. Stage 2, a country becomes a developing country. Then it starts investing abroad, but much smaller investment than its inward FDI. It is most invested than it invests abroad. And in stage 3, which is coined by Dunning emerging countries, which is of interest to me, of course, OFDI starts booming, even though it remains still smaller than inward FDI. Next slide, please. Another point about Dunning's IDP model, the explanatory variables of outward foreign direct investment in this model are so-called push factors. that is factors which are specific to home countries and not to host countries, okay? Specific to home countries. And of course, I have tested successfully this model as early as in 2003 for a big sample of developing countries and transition economies. And I have found in this old paper that to explain OFDI from developing and transition economies, I found the significant variables which were home countries' level of economic development, that is GDP per capita as a proxy, home countries' market size, that is the GDP size, home countries' economic growth, that is annual GDP rate of growth, and a more sophisticated variable that I will comment further, home countries' technological level. I would come back to this variable afterwards. Of course, you can find this article published in Transnational Corporations in 2003. That's all for Dunning. And the second theoretical background or theoretical model I mobilized is Matthew's linkage leverage learning model or hypothesis, which has also been tested successfully for the BRICS and for transition economies. So the basic work by Matthews is a book titled Dragon Multinationals Toward a New Model for Global Growth, published in 2002. Please, next slide, please. And in this book and in his model, Matthews showed the significance of the linkage leverage learning transfers to the home country by foreign companies, and he related this to the magnitude of previous inward foreign direct investment made by foreign multinational companies in the home country. So next point, some comparative features of OFDI from the NWICS. If I assume that in Dunning stage 3, if I assume that a country reaches Dunning stage 3, if OFDI to GDP ratio is bigger than 5%, and second criterion, outward FDI to inward FDI ratio is bigger than 25%, then according to table 6, next slide, please, you can see that in 2014, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Nigeria, and Pakistan were not still in the third stage. They are still stuck in the second stage. They are more developing than emerging countries, according to these two criteria. On the other hand, Turkey was on the brink of reaching stage 3 in 2014. Argentina, Chile, and Malaysia had reached this stage 3 in the year 2000, and Colombia, Mexico, the Philippines, and Thailand had reached this stage 3 in 2014. So please, next slide. So we can see that the sample is quite in tune with Dunning's theory, except a few countries. What about strategies and modes of entry used by NWICS-based multinational companies? What I'm going to tell now is the result of my survey of a scattered existing literature, and what I found, but I'm not accountable for this, so I'm not responsible of the response. It is the literature which says that most companies in my sample, in my country sample, have adopted a market-seeking strategy, a market-seeking OFDS strategy. The second strategy in significance is resource-seeking. They invest abroad to secure a supply of natural resources, energy, and so on. The third strategy is asset-seeking OFDI, namely geared towards acquiring high technologies abroad. And the last and the least OFDI strategy is efficiency-seeking or cost-killing strategy. You cannot find it in the sample except with a few Argentine Malaysian and Thai-based multinational companies. In the other countries, they don't have a practice of efficiency seeking investment abroad. The privileged mode of entry is greenfield investment or new investment abroad, but we can witness through the literature a number of trans-border mergers and acquisitions which have been used to take over technological assets abroad and sometimes natural resources which are only available abroad. Next slide, please. A few words about the geographical and industrial distribution of NUICS FDI. So here, detailed information is missing for several NUICs. So again, I refer to the literature. It's not my own work. OFDI from these countries appears to be concentrated basically in neighboring geographical areas. So for instance, if I take the so-called multilatinas means companies, multinational companies based in Latin American countries. And I have 4 of them in my sample: Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. So these 4 countries are investing basically in other Latin American countries. Or if I take Malaysian companies, they are investing basically in Southeast Asia. So this is what I call neighboring geographical areas. And the second area in which they invest is in few developed countries in Europe and North America. And they don't invest very much in developing countries or in least developed countries. As regards industrial distribution of OFDI, it depends on the home country's industrial structure, obviously, but very often in the literature we find that these countries invest first in manufacturing industries, such as cement, chemicals, consumer goods, metallurgy, machinery, telecoms. Then, in second rank, they invest into natural resources and energy. And the last sector for their investment is services and finance. But you have exceptions. For instance, Malaysian companies are very much involved, and they invest first in services and finance ahead of manufacturing or natural resources. Next slide, please. So the last point in my paper is about modeling and testing the determinants of NUICS OFDI. So in tune with Dunning's and Matthews models I referred to before, I took as the explained variable outward foreign direct investment stock from country I in ERT. And my explanatory variables are first, gross domestic product of the home country high in ERT. The second one is the level of economic development, that is GDP per capita, country ERT, or GDP per inhabitant, if you want. The next one is JIT, which is an annual index of GDP growth in the home country in ERT. And then my 2 technological variables. So the first one is the share of high technology exported products in overall export. This is my first technological variable in the home country, and I divided it into 3 classes. So there is a reference class, which are countries that export less than 5% of high-tech products in their overall export. On the other hand, class 3 are those countries which high-tech exports are higher than 25% of overall export, okay? So big exporters in terms of high-tech. My second technological variable is patent, the number of technological patents registered in the home country, I in ERT. And my last variable is the Matthews, I would say the Matthews variable, inward foreign direct investment stock hosted in country I in the previous years, okay? And I took 3 previous years in my calculation, in my econometric estimation. So next slide, please. So the next slide is this wonderful econometric table. So I've tested the model in OLS and then in panel data. So basically, I'm not a professional econometrician, but anyway, what you can see from this, from the results, is that the 3 economic variable specific to home countries, that is GDP per capita, GDP, and GDP growth rate, are significant explanatory variables of outward foreign direct investment of these NWICS countries. Then, as regards to the technological variables, you see that when a NWICS has 25% or more high-tech products in its exports, this is significant to explain OFDI. Okay, so basically it means that those countries in my sample which are more advanced in terms of technology invest more abroad, which is exactly the case of Malaysia or Mexico, for instance, or Thailand. And the second technological variable is patent. So here the coefficient of the variable are all significant, but they are all negative, which is of interest. So what is the meaning of a negative sign associated with the patent registered in the country? This means probably that these countries invest abroad in order to find abroad some technologies which are not available in the home country. If they had invested on the basis of a technological advantage, the coefficient should have been positive, and they are not positive, they are negative. So probably this is the sign that they are investing in some countries which are more advanced than them in terms of technology. And the last variable has been tested on the year T-1, T-2, T-3, and you see that the coefficients are significant and are increasing with time. So I interpret this that first, it validates the existence of a kind of linkage leverage learning process a la Matthews, okay? But you see that the significance of this relationship with FDI stock is increasing over time, which means that previous inward FDI becomes year after year a stronger determinant of outward foreign direct investment. Okay, so next slide, please. As a matter of conclusion, NWICS, to my mind, have become significant foreign direct investors in the global economy during the past 2 decades, first conclusion. And second conclusion, they are now strong competitors to OFDI from the BRICS. They will compete with Brazil, with India, South Africa, etc., and of course Russia, and they will compete increasingly over or against post-communist economies in transition and against Russia. So there is a third unwritten conclusion. For Russia, these 13 countries will become strong competitors in the area of investment abroad. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Andreff. It was really very interesting. And I invite our participants to make your questions, and don't forget to switch on your microphones.
I have to, yeah, there.
Yes, for our participants, yes. Because you can show me in chat also that you want to ask a question. And before people show me their willingness, I also want, as a organizer ask you a question about political aspects. We can see some countries here in this panel which are very dependent on foreign political situation. The best example is Iran, for example. And as we remember, investment development path theory paradoxes, sometimes they were also connected in other countries with political barriers for expansion. Is it possible here to study the role of political barriers or maybe stimulus for outward FDI from these new wave emerging countries, or Iran, frankly speaking, is the only real exception, and it is better not to make your model more complicated due to political considerations?
Okay. Could I respond right
Yes.
now? Yeah.
Yes, I suppose.
You hear me? Okay. So it's a good point. I receive your question more like a suggestion to include additional variables in my model. In fact, indeed, in my model, there is no political variables.
Yes, I
pointed that. And it may be relevant to have some kind of political variables. We have to discuss about which kind of variable we can introduce, but obviously for not only for Iran, but for different countries, you have a political issue. For instance, Egypt is also a case in point. Or in Chile, long ago, there was a kind of revolution or etc. They had the Pinochet. And so nearly in all emerging countries, you have very strong political processes, and they may have affected foreign direct investment, both inward and outward. So for sure, an improvement of the model could be to introduce some kind of political variables. Definitely, I agree on this point. Now, the second aspect of my response is that in my papers regarding OFDI from BRICS and from post-communist transition economies, usually I wrote a section in my paper about home countries' policies toward foreign direct investment. And this I did not for my new example. So another stage of my research could be to check which kind of incentive policy to outward foreign direct investment have been or have not been put at work in these countries. And this would be surely another interesting paper. But so far, I did not achieve this research, but it's a good suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, do we have some questions? You can also show me your questions in the chat if you have some problems with techniques.
I see Sergei Lukonin.
Yes, I see. Well, Sergey, you want to ask a question, please? Your floor. The floor is yours. Or you can write in chat if you have.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I have some problems with video, but it's okay. Dear Vladimir, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. As I'm a specialist in Chinese economy, I would like to ask you about the question about China. Have you seen any changes in the policy of Chinese foreign direct investment after the sanction war between China and United States begins?
Okay. I'm not such a specialist of China. Of course, China.
I do not want to ask you about any digit, but I would like to ask you about your understanding of these processes.
My understanding. Okay. So I would say that the commercial war and maybe something worse in the future may happen between the US and China because it's a question of economic and possibly political leadership over the world. You know, nowadays with Donald Trump, the official watchword in the US is, we would not like to be any longer the leaders in the world economy, in world politics. I mean, America first, okay? Which is quite different from previous regimes or politicians who are thinking that not only America first, but first in the world, which means we are the leaders. And this has changed with Donald Trump. On the other hand, Xi Jinping is for sure, I never met him. I never met Xi Jinping, of course, but I know a few Chinese economists, and nowadays I think that China is really willing to become the leader of the world in some sense. They are already the second economy in the world in terms of GDP, for instance. Their power, their political power is increasing over a number of countries. I think about Africa in particular. They are the major foreign investors in Africa now. They have a very strong political influence in Africa. And they are also present in Latin America as well. So everything is ready to have a strong struggle between China and the US for maybe the world leadership. Afterwards, we have to talk about this with politicians and specialists in international relations, political relations, and I am not one of them. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Well, President Andreff, I also have the second question, and if the audience is silent, I will ask you. When you determine your sample, you use some borders, for example, GDP per capita as the border for developed countries and so on. And of course, all these limits, in any case, are voluntary. So if you change the limits, and for example, this panel will be not 13 countries, but for example, 15 countries or only 10 countries, and we understand that these limits can change in time, 10 years ago, 10 years after our meeting. What do you think? Is it a real stable group with maybe slight changes, or it is only a picture of nowadays situation, and after 10 years we cannot say about such group at all?
Okay, good point. So when you take a definition, you have a definition, okay, and then you have the result, which is the 13 countries. But basically, I do agree that any sample of countries change over time. So do you remember the story of the BRICS? At the beginning, there were only 4. There was not South Africa. It was without South Africa. And afterwards, someone said, oh yes, but look, South Africa resembles to some extent to India, Russia, and so on, okay? So someone added South Africa to the sample, okay? And referring now to my own sample, look, if I go back 20 or 25 years ago, my sample would be only 12 countries without Iran, because Iran started investing abroad only in the late 90s, okay? If I go back 30 years ago, I would be left with only 10 countries because Pakistan and Nigeria started investing only in the late 1980s, you know? So indeed, and so if you are looking the sample over time, probably it would change. Maybe in the future, you will have more than 13 countries. You said 15 countries, why not? It might be the case with the same criterion. But also you can change the sample in another way around, which is you adjust the criterion, because $1 billion in 2014 is not the same magnitude as, let's say, $1 billion in 2030. Okay, so if you take the same value, $1 billion in 2030, the sample will be bigger, definitely bigger, simply due to the fact that $1 billion is not the same thing 15 years later. So, of course, there is always a question of how you will manage your sample. You know, the BRICS sample 20 years ago, everyone was speaking, wow, the BRICS, it was fantastic. Now, okay, it's more original to talk about the NWICS instead of the BRICS. Okay, so why not? But you are correct. From the methodological standpoint, the sample will evolve anyway.
Thank you. So we have at the moment a question from Natalia Karpova, and then I introduce the question from Professor Boris Heifetz, who cannot speak without microphone. So Natalia Karpova, please.
Hello, everybody. Professor Andreff, thank you so much for really meaty, very thoughtful observation. I just want to ask you a question, somehow connected with one of the previous ones, about the inward foreign direct investment in European Union. Do you see that after this coronavirus, COVID shock, the interest in foreign direct investment in Europe will be revitalized, or Europe or maybe separate countries will be still closed for Chinese investments or other investments, or it depends on the branch? So do you see some general approach to foreign direct investments in Europe? We know that we observed that during the last 2-3 years, it was more or less strict limits for Chinese investments, for example. But maybe after the virus, after this quite complicated situation, many industries, say HoReCa or maybe sports or others, will be more open for foreign direct investments from abroad, or it looks for you as conservative configuration of interests, and Europe will be quite accurate and protective in letting international investments in. What do you think about it?
Thank you for your question. It's a very difficult question because it is about the future. And okay, so it would be more guesstimates or guesses than anything else. But I would make 2 points that we can make right now. The first thing that you have to know is that you were referring to inward foreign direct investment in Europe. So if you take Europe as the EU countries, the 27 or 28 EU countries, the major part of our inward and outward investment, foreign direct investment, is from EU countries. So where Germany is investing first? In France. Where France is investing first? In Germany. So the basic issue for EU countries right now is that the borders are closed for 2 months between us, among EU countries. And probably as soon as the borders will be open, which will be next week, within 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there will be a recovery. I'm not saying a recovery to the same level as before, but there will be a recovery in investment across EU countries. This is nearly for sure. I'm ready to bet with you about that, okay? And now, talking about investment, in world investment in EU countries by countries from other continents, China, Russia, the US, and so on. Here, it's much more difficult to make a prediction or forecast, because there are many factors at play in this question. But what appeared, for instance, in France, is that the French, with the virus, with the COVID-19, what appeared in France is that our economy was too much dependent on imports from countries outside the EU, and namely China. We were importing masks from China. We were importing drugs and medicines from China to a big extent. And then there is a new talk among politicians in France, from the left wing to the right wing. Many people are saying and thinking, now we have to produce these medicines in France, or at least in the EU, but basically in France. And we have to produce the masks, and we started up in a hurry to produce masks in France, or at least in Belgium, which are across the border, etc. Okay, and this indeed will affect for sure foreign trade between China and EU countries. For sure, trade will be lower in some industries, as you told. You have to check this industry by industry. In some industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, textile industry, where French companies, German companies, British companies have relocated all the production abroad, namely in China, in India, and so on. Probably this trend of globalization will stop, or will not be of the same extent. It will reduce, and probably a number of activities or industries will be relocated back into the EU. And if this happens, foreign direct investment from China to the EU will decrease. It's a yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's
We
quite
also
logical.
have
Thank
we also have a question from Professor Boris Hefetz, who is in the staff of the Institute of Economy and Financial University. It is in chat. He asked about prospects of FDI, but not under influence of a new crisis, but under increasing tendency of economic nationalism. So, Professor Andreff, what do you think about the role of the increasing processes of economical nationalism for FDI?
So, again, it's a difficult question for an economist, maybe not for a politician, a political scientist, but for me, it's a difficult question. But again, personally, since I started up working on foreign direct investment in the early 70s, I passed my PhD dissertation in 1975. In French language, it was probably the first dissertation on globalization. The title was something like Profits and Structure in World Capitalism. So the world, I was not using globalization, but I was talking about world capitalism. And in this study, one aspect was exactly this one. Which are the countries which are more open or not open to foreign direct investment? And obviously, the most liberal countries with no trade barriers, no obstacle to foreign direct investment are obviously the most open. But again, I had a second thought, because I saw that step by step, you know that the former communist countries, since Lenin 1929 in the Soviet Union, these countries are forbidden foreign direct investment. Nevertheless, in the 1980s and 1990s, I was able to check Russian companies investing abroad, Hungarian companies investing abroad, Czech companies investing abroad, Polish companies investing abroad. And step by step, as you may know, as early as in the 1970s, Hungary opened the door to inward foreign direct investment, Yugoslavia even earlier, and then step by step, Poland and other countries. So the problem is that you can have a very strong nationalism in political terms, while you are hosting foreign direct investment. You know, Lenin probably was a nationalist, okay? But he decided, okay, we open the door to a few inward investors. Why not? So again, and on the side of investors, I checked this in my PhD dissertation as well 40 years ago. From a capitalist point of view, I am the big boss of a multinational company, imagine. Okay, what do I prefer? A very open and liberal economy in which I may have a riot or a revolution every day, which is absolutely unstable, or a very strong dictatorship in which the rules are absolutely clear. I don't like these rules, but they are absolutely clear and stable, okay? Then in some cases, and this is what happened in Chile, before Pinochet, Chile was a left-wing country, nationalist, etc., and they were not able to attract a lot of foreign direct investment. Then Pinochet made a kind of coup. He took over the power and he became a dictator. And what happened? A lot of foreign investors came to Chile, saying, okay, well, it's a stable economy. Moreover, advised by Chicago boys. They are good economists, and the foreign investors came. So it's a very complex issue because you cannot connect directly something which is political nationalism with something which is basically economics, which is why some company decide to invest abroad. Okay, and this is the reason why I have not a very sure response to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Andreff. Do we have any other questions for Professor Andreff? Colleagues, I don't see anything in chat and no signal. Yes, yeah, I suppose, yeah. So, Professor Andreff, thank you very much for your report and your answers, and I am glad that despite all these coronavirus problems, we indeed managed to make your honorary report in our world economy section.
Okay, thank you. I was happy to participate, and maybe another year in Russia or in Moscow, maybe.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Наталья, спасибо за помощь.
Спасибо вам большое.
Спасибо.
Окей, thank you, Наталья. Спасибо вам большое. До свидания.
До свидания.
Спасибо, да. Технически все без сучка, без задоринки прошло. Спасибо.
Прекрасно. Всем хорошего дня и здоровья.
Спасибо. Спасибо. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Наталья, могу завершить?
Да. Спасибо большое вам.
Спасибо вам, да, до свидания.
Коллеги, хорошего вечера.